Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss a report that suggests our glorious Brexit government may have cocked up another aspect of their magnificent plans to lock Brexit into British politics for the long term. It seems that their attempts to smooth the process of joining the Pacific Trading Bloc, the CPTPP, may have backfired just a tad. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, I've discussed the government's plans to join the CPTPP a few times, and even recently, basically, accession to this group wouldn't really do anything for us. The government are promoting it as a way of joining a trading bloc that, unlike the EU, doesn't lay down a load of rules and regulations on its members. It's not true, of course. Any trading bloc has rules, and anyone wishing to be a member will have to follow those rules, whether they like them or not. And guess what? We're not going to decide those rules. In fact, because the UK is less valuable to Pacific nations than to European nations, we will almost certainly be less likely to get away with rules we don't like. You know, as members of the EU, it has to be said that there were a very small number of rules that we didn't really follow. Other member states do the same, wasn't just us, from time to time. The larger ones more likely to get away with it, as long as it's not causing too much of a stink amongst the other members. But joining the CPTPP isn't really going to do much for trade for either the UK or the existing members, so it's hard to see why they would put up with any poor behaviour on our part when it comes to following those rules. Besides, I've read that they're resistant to the idea of giving the UK anything that looks like a good deal, even though due to the relatively low levels of trade between us, it wouldn't be that big a deal in itself. But the problem is that China is also looking to join, and the existing members really don't need to give China an excuse to demand better terms. I mean, you know, if they give us good terms, China will go, well, why don't you give, we're more important to you, why don't you give us them? Because that would absolutely skew trade for them. So they can't really. Also, it's not lost on me the irony that Rishi Sunak, who has been sounding very hawkish on China of late, has a policy of wanting to join a trading bloc that would include China. But never mind that. The Tories don't want to join because of the economic benefits, because those are very, very small. As a minister revealed recently, they want to join to make it harder for a future government to strike deals with the EU, which could give us a much closer trading relationship again. And now the clock's ticking, because back when we left the EU, the Tories may have imagined they had this parliament and then probably they'd win another election as well, albeit with a smaller majority. You know, to bed in Brexit more firmly, they may have imagined they had a good 9 or 10 more years. You know, their win was so massive and Labour's loss so catastrophic that for Labour to win the next election would need a swing so large that basically it never happened before. Unfortunately for them, they failed to take account of just how incompetent their government was going to be. The problem is that Brexit makes no sense to people who have it explained to them. Ministers have access to a whole range of experts to explain any and all policy details to them. So in order to deliver Brexit, the last thing you want in government are people who are intelligent and wise. No, the opposite if you'd like. So is it any surprise that strategies then go awry? And the same seems to have happened here. Now, I'd already talked about how our behaviour regarding the Northern Ireland Protocol is presenting a barrier to CPTPP membership. You know, they're quite clear. There's no point agreeing something with a country who doesn't keep their promises, even more, especially when those promises are written down in a legally binding document, no less. So without a genuine settlement on the Northern Ireland Protocol, it seems there will be no accession to this trading bloc. And the Tories now, they've only got 2 years to get that membership. They may have imagined they had an extra 4 or 5 years. Now they've got 2. Maximum of 2. That's assuming they don't implode next year and we end up with a general election before the end of next year. You know, so they'll be hoping that they get this membership so that will prevent the UK joining a customs union with the EU in the future. That's what the idea of it is, according to a Tory minister himself who wrote it perfectly openly last week or the week before, was it? But there's another problem. So according to an article in the Financial Times, the reason the government was so desperate for a trade deal with Australia was to try and make accession to the CPTPP easier. Australia is, of course, already a member. The problem is that it seems to have done the opposite. So for those who are not aware, our trade agreement with Australia is stunningly awful. Do you know how bad it was? Same with the New Zealand one. Media outlets in Australia and New Zealand, when they're reporting on the agreement, went, we cannot believe that the UK has agreed to this. You know, none of our post-Brexit trade deals are better than those we had in the EU. There are several that are significantly worse. Most of them are just carry-on deals. But the Australia deal is so bad that a former cabinet minister even called it out in Parliament the other week. It doesn't really come online for quite a few years, presumably to make sure that the ministers who were responsible for it were no longer in power and well clear of the blast zone when the very damaging consequences hit. Very bad for our farming, undermines our environmental standards, and the government's own economic impact assessment thinks that it's worth less than 0.1% boost to GDP. And that's, you know, potentially an optimistic appraisal. So it's not actually going to boost our economy, basically. Cracking deal for Australia, though. And that's the problem. Other members of the CPTPP are looking at it and going, right, we'll have one of those trade deals then. Obviously, the UK government isn't all that keen to replicate the deal with loads of other countries because it's really bad for us. They knew it was bad for us at the time. You know, even the Tories aren't that stupid. So the situation is as follows. In order to make it harder for a future government to unpick Brexit, the Tories, as part of that strategy, want to join the CPTPP. However, there are at least two doors that need unlocking in order to make this a reality. Probably there's a few others as well. We have to show that we abide by our international agreement, which means sorting the Northern Ireland Protocol out, and the other members look like trying to get something close to an Australia-style deal for themselves before they get behind UK membership. Tricky. To resolve the Northern Ireland Protocol is likely to require the ERG at least to accept that the protocol is not going to be renegotiated and must be complied with in its current form, albeit with some practical arrangements agreed. It remains to be seen how realistic the ERG are about this. Second problem is that Sunak's government don't seem all that keen on giving away stupid concessions for the sake of Daily Express headlines in trade negotiations. You know, that was all part of Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, the lunatics. Rishi Sunak is a little bit more cautious. So he seems to want to proceed with, with an attitude of can we get a good deal, not just give everything away. Thing is, after the Australia deal, some other members, Canada seemingly particularly, want to hold out for more concessions for themselves now. It's ironic that Boris Johnson's government pushed hard for the Australia deal, making all sorts of mad concessions, some at the last minute, in order to make it easier to join the CPTPP. But it turns out they may have been better off not having bothered with any trade agreement at all. And my reaction to hearing this at the time was, well, what do we expect? If Brexit requires a government that understands nothing about international trade to get it through, then of course their international trade policy is going to keep going wrong. Their strategy will keep failing because they're people who don't understand international trade. It's the eternal struggle with Brexit, isn't it? Supporters say the problems are down to incompetent handling. And it's like, yeah, okay. There is certainly a case for saying it's being incompetently handled. But that's largely down to the fact competent handling is not really in tandem with Brexit. A more competent government could indeed have managed the process better. But why would they? Why would they be motivated to do that? A more competent government would have taken softer roads out of the EU. I mean, no roads at all if they'd been in place early enough. A competent government would have accepted the offer to extend the transition period to deal with the pandemic first, instead of rushing a trade agreement. A competent government would have allowed trade negotiations with the EU, and other countries come to that, to take as long as was necessary to get a good deal. A competent government would have made sure we had systems in place to cope with being a third country before we became a third country. All of these things would have delayed what the hard Brexiteers considered a real Brexit for years, and they knew it, potentially leading to them all being reversed before we even properly got off the ground. That's the issue. Brexit requires a pig-headed refusal to face facts, at least publicly. You know, you could potentially put people in charge who will publicly talk shit, but privately try to face up to the situation. But the Brexiteers wouldn't trust those people to deliver their unicorn hunting grounds. You know, that may be what you're getting with Rishi Sunak. Someone who privately will face up to the realities and publicly talk shit. But you'll notice the hardcore Brexiteers don't trust Sunak, even though he actually campaigned for Brexit. You know, and for good reason. So yeah, there seems to be a few barriers to joining this bloc now. It may well be a case of wondering just how desperately Sunak wants it. We can see that some Brexit supporting Tories want it to scupper Labour in the future. Maybe even scupper a future Tory government that comes to its senses, who knows? That being said, it's the hard Brexiteers who are providing a serious obstacle to this in terms of their objections to the protocol at least. I mean, I never said they were clever. But how much does Sunak really want it? If the answer is not very much, then it looks likely we'll avoid it before the election, then we can sort of quietly ignore it. If it turns out he desperately does want it, then he's going to have to make sacrifice that he's not currently minded to make. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.